The morning Catherine buried her last chicken, she knew something had to change. 3 months since Robert died and everything on the homestead was falling apart. The roof leaked in 2 places. The fence posts were rotting. The vegetable garden had gone to weeds because she couldn't keep up with it alone. She stood there in the Montana dirt, shovel in hand, looking at the small grave. A fox had gotten into the coop again last night. She'd heard the commotion, but been too afraid to go out in the dark with just a lantern. By morning it was too late. Now she had no chickens, no eggs to sell in town, and winter was coming fast. The banker in town had been clear last week. She had until spring to pay what Robert owed, or the land would be sold. $200. She might as well have needed $2,000. She had $17 hidden in a coffee tin, and no way to earn more before the snow came. Catherine walked back to the cabin, her boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. October in Montana meant winter wasn't far behind. She could already see her breath in the morning air. The woodpile was half what it should be. She'd been cutting what she could, but her hands weren't used to that kind of work. They were covered in blisters and cuts that wouldn't heal right. Inside the cabin, she sat at the table and tried to think. She could go back east to her sister's family, but that meant losing everything Robert had worked for. This land had been his dream. They'd only had 3 years here together before the accident at the lumber mill. 3 years wasn't enough time to build anything solid, to put down real roots. She was 26 years old and completely alone. No children, no family within 500 miles. No husband to help carry the load. Just her and a piece of land she didn't know how to keep. The knock on the door made her jump. Nobody came out this far without a reason. The nearest neighbor was 4 miles away. She grabbed Robert's old rifle from above the fireplace. Her hand shook as she moved to the window. A man stood on her porch. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a thick beard and long hair tied back. He wore buckskin clothes and heavy boots. A large pack rested at his feet. He didn't look like anyone from town. "Ma'am, I mean no trouble," he called out. "Name's Jacob Stone. I knew your husband some years back." Catherine kept the rifle pointed at the door. "Robert never mentioned you. We worked together up north before he settled here. Logging camps near the Canadian border. I just heard about what happened. Came to pay respects." She opened the door a crack, keeping the gun ready. Up close, she could see the man was older than she'd first thought. Maybe 45, maybe 50. Hard to tell with men who lived rough. His face was weathered like old leather, with lines around his eyes from squinting in bright snow. But his eyes were clear and steady. "You're a long way from the logging camps," she said. "I don't log anymore. Trap and hunt in the high country now. Been up in the mountains since spring. Came down for supplies and heard the news in town." He gestured to the broken fence. "Looks like you could use some help around here." "I can't pay for help." Jacob shook his head. "Wasn't asking for pay. Robert saved my life once up in the camps. Tree fell wrong, pinned me down. He got me out. Figure I owe him something even if he's gone." Catherine wanted to believe him, but she'd learned to be careful. "What kind of help are you talking about?" "Whatever needs doing. I can see plenty from here. Roof, fence, woodpile, that coop door hanging off its hinge. I'm good with my hands. Know how to make things last through winter." She studied him for a long moment. He didn't look away, didn't fidget. Just stood there patient as a stone. Finally, she lowered the rifle. "I've got a barn that's mostly sound. You can sleep there if you want. I can feed you what I've got, but it isn't much. That'll do fine." Jacob worked from sunrise to sunset that first day. She watched him from the cabin window, still not entirely trusting. He fixed the chicken coop first, reinforcing it with scrap wood and adding a better latch. Then he started on the fence, digging out the rotten posts and setting new ones. He worked steady and smooth like a man who'd spent his whole life using his hands. That evening, she brought him supper in the barn. Just beans and cornbread, but he thanked her like it was a feast. They sat in the barn doorway, eating in silence while the sun went down behind the mountains. "You planning to stay through winter?" Jacob asked finally. "Don't have much choice. This is all I've got." He nodded slowly. "Winter's hard up here, especially alone." "You got enough food put by?" "Some, not as much as I should. You know how to trap?" "Hunt ice fish?" Catherine shook her head. "Robert always handled that. I just kept the garden and the chickens." Jacob stared out at the darkening mountains. "I could teach you, if you want. The things you need to know to make it through." "Why would you do that?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he did, his voice was soft. I got no family, Catherine. No wife, no children. I'm getting older. And I've been thinking about what happens when I can't trap anymore, can't handle the mountains. A man likes to know he'll leave something behind, you know? Someone to remember he was here. She didn't understand what he was getting at. I don't follow. Jacob turned to look at her directly. I've got a proposition for you. Not a simple one. And you'll probably want to throw me off your land for saying it. But hear me out because I think it could solve both our problems. Catherine's heart started beating faster. Go on. I'll help you keep this place. Teach you everything you need to know about surviving out here. Fix what needs fixing. Get you ready for winter. Help you earn enough to pay that bank debt. In return, I want one thing. He paused. I want a son. The words hung in the cold air between them. Catherine felt her face go hot. You want what? A boy to carry my name. To teach my skills to. Someone who'll remember me when I'm gone. Jacob held up his hand before she could speak. I'm not talking about taking advantage. I'm talking about marriage, proper and legal. You'd be my wife. The boy would be legitimate. But I know how it sounds, so I'll give you time to think on it. Catherine stood up so fast she nearly dropped her plate. You're out of your mind. Maybe. But think about it anyway. You need help you can't afford. I need a legacy before it's too late. We could help each other. She left without another word, practically running back to the cabin. Inside, she barred the door and sat in Robert's chair, shaking. The nerve of that man, coming here with his strange offer like she was some kind of desperate fool. But later that night, lying in bed unable to sleep, she found herself thinking about it. She was desperate. That was the truth. And Jacob hadn't been wrong about winter. She didn't know enough to make it through alone. Already she was struggling, and the real cold hadn't even started. By morning, she still didn't know what to think. But when she looked out the window, Jacob was already back at work on the fence, steady as before. Like he'd said his piece and was willing to wait for her answer, however long it took. Catherine poured herself coffee and watched him work. Robert had been gone 3 months. The land he'd loved was slipping through her fingers. And here was a stranger offering her a way to keep it, asking for something she wasn't sure she could give. Winter was coming, and she had to decide. 3 days passed before Catherine spoke to Jacob about anything beyond basic necessities. He worked on the homestead each day, methodical and patient. He rebuilt the woodshed, patched the roof, cleared the irrigation ditch. Each night she brought him supper and they ate in silence, but his words kept circling in her mind. A son. Marriage. A solution to problems she couldn't solve alone. On the 4th morning, she found him splitting logs by the woodpile. The autumn sun was bright, and he'd removed his outer shirt, working in just a wool undershirt despite the cold. She watched the steady rhythm of his work. Each swing of the axe was precise, controlled. Nothing wasted. I have questions, she said. Jacob set down the axe and wiped his forehead. Fair enough. This arrangement you're proposing. What exactly would it look like? He walked over to the fence rail and leaned against it. We'd get married proper with a preacher. Legal papers and everything. I'd stay through winter, teach you what you need to know. Help you earn enough to clear your debt, and we'd... He paused, choosing his words carefully. We'd live as husband and wife. Catherine felt her cheeks warm but pushed forward. And then what? You just leave once you get what you want? Not exactly. I'd go back to my trap lines come spring, yes. That's my living, and I'm too old to change now. But I'd come back regular. Help with heavy work, bring money from furs. The boy would know his father. And you'd have the freedom to run this place your own way. Why would you want that? A family you're hardly with? Jacob looked out at the mountains. I've lived alone for 15 years. Lost my first wife and baby daughter to cholera back in Missouri. Couldn't stand to stay in one place after that, so I came west. Kept moving, kept to myself. Figured it was easier to be alone than risk that kind of hurt again. He turned back to her. But I'm 47 now. Another few years and I'll be too old for the hard winter trapping. Too old to have a family at all. I don't want to die alone in some mountain cave, Catherine. I want to know I mattered to someone. His honesty caught her off guard. She'd expected him to be crude about it or demanding. Instead, he sounded lonely. Just as lonely as she felt. I don't love you, she said bluntly. I know that. I don't love you either. But respect is possible, maybe even affection given time. Catherine sat down on a stump thinking hard. If I agreed if we did this, I'd need promises. Name them. You don't touch me until we're properly married. And even after, you treat me with respect. This is a partnership, not ownership. Agreed. The land stays in my name. If something happens to you, I don't lose everything again. That's fair. And the child, boy or girl, gets raised right, with love and care, not just as some legacy for you to point to. Jacob nodded seriously. Any child of mine would be loved. That I promise you. She sat there, hands clasped in her lap, trying to see a future in this strange arrangement. People in town will talk. They always do. But you'll have a husband and your land. That's what matters. Catherine looked at her hands. They were rough now, covered in small scars from work she hadn't known she'd have to do. 3 months ago, she'd been a wife with a future. Now she was a widow with debts and a stranger offering her an unusual way out. I need one more day to think, she said. Take all the time you need. That night, Catherine pulled out the old letters Robert had written her before they married. Sweet words about building a life together, about dreams and hopes. She cried reading them, mourning not just her husband but the future they'd planned. But tears didn't pay debts. Tears didn't keep land. And tears didn't teach her how to survive a Montana winter alone. By morning, she'd made her decision. She found Jacob working on the barn door. I'll do it, she said simply. But we do this right. Jacob straightened up. We will. 2 days later, they rode to town together in Catherine's wagon. The circuit preacher had a small church there, serving the scattered homesteads and mining camps in the area. Reverend Walsh was a kind man in his 60s who'd known, Robert, this is quick, he said gently to Catherine when they explained what they wanted. It's practical, she replied. The Reverend looked between them. Marriage is more than practical, daughter, Jacob spoke up. We understand that, Reverend, but we're also not children. We both know what we're doing and why. We'll honor the vows we take. Reverend Walsh studied them for a long moment, then nodded. I'll need witnesses. They found 2 men at the trading post. One was an older trapper named Bill, who knew Jacob from the mountains. The other was a young prospector passing through. Neither asked questions, just signed the papers afterward. The ceremony was short. Catherine wore her only good dress, dark blue wool. Jacob had cleaned up, trimmed his beard, and wore a proper shirt. When he said his vows, his voice was steady. When she said hers, she meant every word, even if they weren't spoken out of love. The Reverend pronounced them married, and Jacob kissed her cheek gently. Not her lips, just her cheek, like he understood she needed time. They spent their wedding night in the cabin with Jacob sleeping in the barn as he had been. Catherine lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand what she'd just done. She was married again, to a man she barely knew, for reasons that had nothing to do with romance. But in the morning, when she saw the marriage certificate on the table, something settled in her chest. She wasn't alone anymore. For better or worse, she had a partner now. Jacob started teaching her that same day. First lesson was rabbit snares. They walked into the woods behind the cabin and he showed her how to read the trails where rabbits like to run. You're looking for fresh droppings, he explained, crouching down. And these marks on the brush where they push through regular. That tells you their path. Catherine knelt beside him, watching carefully. His hands moved with practiced ease, setting the wire snare just so. The trick is thinking like the rabbit, he continued. They're creatures of habit. Same paths, same times. You use that against them. Over the next week, she learned to set snares, check trap lines, and skin rabbits. It was hard work, messy and sometimes discouraging. But Jacob never lost patience. When she made mistakes, he just showed her again. You're doing fine, he said one evening as she struggled with a particularly tough hide. I've seen grown men give up faster than you. I don't have the option to give up. No, he agreed. But you're not just surviving out of desperation. You're learning. That's different. In the evenings, they sat by the fire while he taught her other things. How to read weather signs in the clouds and wind. Which plants stayed good through winter for medicine. How to tell if ice was thick enough to walk on. Catherine found herself actually enjoying these lessons. Jacob had a quiet way of explaining things that made sense. He didn't talk down to her or act like she was stupid for not knowing. He just taught. One night, about 3 weeks after the wedding, she asked him about his life before. You said you lost a wife and daughter. What were their names? Jacob was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. Elizabeth and little Anne. Anne was just 2 years old when the cholera came through our town. Elizabeth lasted 4 days. Anne was gone in 2. His voice was rough. I buried them together under an oak tree. Then I packed what I could carry and left Missouri. Never went back, I'm sorry. Long time ago now. But that kind of loss, it changes a man. Makes him careful about getting close to people again. Catherine understood that. She'd been careful too these past months. Careful not to hope too much, not to trust too easily. But sitting here with Jacob, learning from him, she felt something shifting. Not love, not yet, but maybe the beginning of trust. "Thank you for teaching me all this," she said. "You're a good student. Robert would be proud of how you're handling things." They sat in comfortable silence after that. Outside, the first real snow of the season began to fall. Winter was here. But for the first time since Robert died, Catherine didn't feel quite so afraid of it. Jacob stood up, stretching. "I should head to the barn." "Jacob," she said, making a decision. "You could stay in here. There's space by the fire. No sense freezing in the barn." He looked at her carefully. "You sure about that?" "We're married. Might as well start acting like it." That night, Jacob slept by the fireplace while Catherine took the bed. It was a small step, but it meant something. They were building something here, she realized. Maybe not what she'd had with Robert, but something real nonetheless. And come spring, if everything went according to plan, there would be a child, a son for Jacob, security for her, a future neither of them had thought they'd have. It was strange and unconventional, but it was theirs. November brought heavy snow to the Montana mountains. Catherine woke one morning to find the world transformed, everything covered in white that sparkled in the early light. Beautiful, but dangerous if you didn't know what you were doing. Jacob was already up checking their supplies. He'd been teaching her to think ahead, always planning for the next month, the next storm. "Winter doesn't give second chances," he'd told her. "You prepare right or you suffer." They'd worked hard through October. Catherine could now set a trap line, check it in darkness, and bring home rabbits or marten. She'd learned to read the forest, to see signs that had been invisible to her before. Her hands were stronger. Her back didn't ache as much from the work. But more than that, something had changed between her and Jacob. They'd settled into a rhythm together, working side by side like a team. He still slept by the fireplace, still gave her space and respect. But there was an ease between them now that hadn't been there at first. "We need to head up to the high meadow today," Jacob said over breakfast. "Check the deer trails. This snow will make tracking easier." Catherine bundled into her warmest clothes. Jacob had traded for better boots for her in town, knowing her old ones wouldn't last the winter. Small kindnesses like that had become common. He'd also bought her a good wool coat, saying it was practical rather than a gift, but she'd seen how carefully he'd picked it out. They walked through the snow-covered forest, Jacob moving with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent decades in wild country. Catherine followed, trying to match his quiet footsteps. He'd taught her that noise scared away game and that patience was more important than speed. "There," Jacob whispered, pointing to tracks in the snow. "Buck. Good size too, from the depth of the prints." Catherine studied the tracks. She was learning to read them like Jacob did, seeing stories written in the snow. This deer had been through maybe an hour ago, heading toward the stand of pines on the ridge. They followed the trail slowly. Jacob had his rifle ready, and he'd taught Catherine to carry Robert's old gun properly. She wasn't a great shot yet, but she was improving. Last week she'd brought down her first deer, a young doe. Jacob had praised her patience, her steady hand. The buck appeared suddenly, a magnificent animal with a full rack of antlers. It stood in a clearing, head up, testing the wind. Jacob gestured for Catherine to take the shot. Her heart pounded as she raised the rifle, remembering everything he'd taught her. "Breathe steady. Don't rush. Squeeze, don't pull." The shot rang out across the frozen landscape. The buck leaped and ran, but only made it 30 yards before falling. Clean shot, right where Jacob had showed her. "Well done," Jacob said, genuine pride in his voice. They spent the next 2 hours field dressing the animal and hauling the meat back. Hard work, but Catherine felt a sense of accomplishment she'd never known before. This meat would last them weeks. She'd provided it herself. That evening, with venison cooking over the fire, Jacob pulled out a piece of wood he'd been carving. Catherine had noticed him working on it in the evenings but hadn't asked about it. Now she could see what it was becoming. A small cradle, simple but beautifully made. "For the baby," he said simply. Catherine felt something catch in her chest. They'd been married 2 months now, living together, working together. but they hadn't talked about that part of their arrangement. Not directly. Jacob, she started, not sure what to say. He set down the carving. I know we agreed to this for practical reasons, and I've tried to be patient to let you get comfortable. But winter's wearing on, Catherine. If we're going to keep our agreement, well. He trailed off, looking uncomfortable for the first time since she'd known him. Catherine had been thinking about this too, more than she wanted to admit. Jacob had proven himself to be decent and kind. He'd taught her so much, asked for nothing but her company and respect. And somewhere along the way, her feelings had shifted. She no longer saw him as a stranger with a strange proposal. She saw a good man who'd been hurt by life, trying to find meaning again. I know, she said quietly. I've been thinking about it too. That night, their marriage became real in every sense. Jacob was gentle and patient, just as he'd been with everything else. And Catherine found that what she felt wasn't duty or obligation, but something warmer. Not the passionate love she'd had with Robert, but something solid and true. Afterward, lying in the darkness, Jacob spoke softly. Thank you for giving an old mountain man a chance. You're not that old, and you've given me more than a chance. You've given me a future. As winter deepened, they fell into a new rhythm. Catherine continued learning, but now there was more warmth between them. Jacob told her stories at night about his years in the wilderness. She told him about her childhood back east, about Robert, about the dreams she'd had. Do you ever regret it? She asked one night. All those years alone? Jacob thought about it. Yes and no. I needed that time, I think, to heal from losing Elizabeth and Anne. But healing alone is like setting a broken bone wrong. It mends, but not quite right. I think I stayed alone too long. Christmas came and they celebrated quietly. Jacob had trapped several prime fox pelts worth good money. Catherine had been practicing her sewing and made him a proper winter shirt. They exchanged gifts by the fire, and it felt like something more than just keeping up appearances. In January, Catherine realized she was pregnant. She knew before she said anything, knew from the way her body felt different. When she told Jacob, she saw something in his face she'd never seen before, pure joy mixed with fear. Are you sure? He asked. As sure as I can be this early. Jacob sat down heavily, like his legs wouldn't hold him. A child. My child, his voice cracked. I never thought I'd have that again. Catherine reached for his hand. You're going to be a good father. I hope so. God, I hope so. But January's joy turned to terror one bitter cold morning. Catherine woke to find Jacob burning with fever. He'd checked the trapline the day before, despite her warnings about the weather. He must have fallen through thin ice on the creek because his clothes had been soaking wet when he came back. Now he was delirious, his skin hot to touch. Catherine had never been so frightened. She built up the fire, piled every blanket they had on him, tried to get him to drink water. He didn't know where he was, kept calling out names she didn't recognize. The storm outside made getting help impossible. The nearest neighbor was miles away through snow that was still falling. Catherine was on her own, pregnant and terrified, with a man who might die before morning. She remembered everything Jacob had taught her about winter survival. Keep him warm. Keep him hydrated. Don't let the fever burn him up. She worked through the night, changing cold compresses, forcing sips of water past his cracked lips, stoking the fire. By dawn, she was exhausted, but Jacob's fever had broken. He opened his eyes, confused but conscious. Catherine. You scared me half to death, she said, her voice shaking. What happened? Fever. You were burning up all night. She held a cup of water to his lips. Drink. He drank slowly, then looked at her with clear eyes. You took care of me. Of course I did. What else would I do? Some would have panicked. Or given up. You taught me not to panic. And I don't give up. She sat back, suddenly exhausted. Besides, you're my husband. Where else would I be? Jacob reached for her hand. I was wrong, you know. That first day when I said we could have respect and maybe affection, I was wrong. Catherine's heart skipped. What do you mean? I love you, Catherine. I didn't mean to, didn't plan on it. But I do. Tears filled her eyes. She'd been afraid to name what she felt. Afraid it was just gratitude or comfort. But hearing him say it, she knew the truth. I love you too, she whispered. It took Jacob 3 days to recover his strength. During that time, Catherine ran the trap lines alone, checking every snare and trap just as he'd taught her. She brought home 2 rabbits and a marten, skinned them properly, and stretched the pelts to dry. When Jacob finally got out of bed, he found her at the table working on the pelts with steady, confident hands. "You did all this yourself? You taught me well." He sat down across from her, still weak but healing. "You don't need me anymore, do you? You could handle all this alone now." Catherine looked up at him. "Need is complicated. Could I survive without you? Probably. The land, the work, yes, I could manage. But would I want to?" She set down her knife. "No, I wouldn't want to." Jacob smiled, the kind of smile that reached his eyes and made him look years younger. "Good, because I don't want to leave. What about your trap lines? Your life in the mountains? I've had 15 years of that life. Maybe it's time for a different one, a life here with you, with our child." Catherine felt something settle in her chest, a piece she hadn't known she was missing. This strange arrangement, born of desperation and loneliness, had become something neither of them expected. It had become real love, the kind built on respect and trust and shared hardship. Outside, the Montana winter continued its bitter rain. But inside the cabin, something warmer had taken root. Something worth fighting for, worth staying for, worth building a future on. Jacob reached across the table and took her hand. "Thank you for taking a chance on an old mountain man. Thank you for keeping your promise to a desperate widow." They sat there in the firelight. Two people who'd found each other in the hardest of circumstances and made something good from it. The cradle sat in the corner, half finished. Come spring, there would be a child. Come summer, the land would be theirs, free and clear. And come whatever seasons followed, they'd face them together. February in Montana was the cruelest month. The cold settled in bone deep and the snow seemed endless. But inside the cabin, Catherine and Jacob had found a rhythm that felt almost like contentment. Catherine's belly was starting to show now. A small curve that Jacob looked at with wonder every time he thought she wasn't watching. He'd finished the cradle and started on other things. A small rocking horse, tiny wooden blocks. His hands were always busy, always creating something for the child he'd never expected to have. "You'll spoil this baby before it's even born," Catherine teased one evening, watching him sand a wooden toy smooth. "After Anne died, I put away all the things I'd made for her. Couldn't stand to look at them. Gave them away to the first family I saw." Jacob ran his thumb over the wood. "This time I want to do it right. I want this child to know their father made these things with love." Catherine moved to sit beside him. "Tell me about Anne. What was she like?" Jacob was quiet for a long moment. He rarely talked about his first family in detail. She had her mother's eyes, dark brown like chestnuts, and she was fearless. Would climb anything, chase any animal, laugh at thunder. Elizabeth used to worry she'd break her neck before she turned 3. His voice grew soft, but it wasn't her fearlessness that killed her. Just bad water and bad luck. "Do you think Elizabeth would approve of this? Of you?" Jacob considered. "Yes, she'd want me to be happy, to have a family again." Elizabeth was practical like that. She'd say 15 years of mourning was more than enough. A loud crack split the air outside, making them both jump. Jacob was on his feet instantly, grabbing his coat and rifle. "What was that?" Catherine asked. "Tree coming down, or maybe ice breaking. Stay here." But Catherine wasn't about to sit idle. She bundled up and followed him out. The cold hit like a physical blow, stealing her breath. By the light of the moon on snow, they could see the problem. A huge pine tree had fallen, and not naturally. The trunk was splintered halfway up, broken by the weight of ice and snow. "It missed the barn by 10 feet, Jacob said, relief in his voice. Then he noticed where Catherine was looking, and his face went pale. The tree had fallen across their main path to the creek. More importantly, it had crushed their sluice box and damaged the water pipe Jacob had rigged to keep a supply running even in winter. "We can rebuild," Catherine said. "Not before we run out of water. That's our main source." They spent the next hour assessing the damage by lantern light. It was worse than they'd first thought. The pipe was shattered in 3 places, and the sluice that caught snowmelt was completely destroyed. They had maybe 3 days of water stored in the cabin. "We'll have to melt snow," Catherine said. "People do it all the time. For drinking, yes. But you're pregnant. You need clean water, plenty of it. And we need water for cooking, washing." Jacob kicked at the frozen ground. "I'll have to go to town, get proper pipe and tools to fix this right." "In this weather?" "Jacob, that's a 2-day trip in good conditions. I don't have a choice. We need that water supply." They argued about it that night, rare for them. Catherine didn't want him risking the journey. Jacob insisted it was the only option. Finally, exhausted, they agreed he'd wait one more day to see if the weather cleared. But the weather didn't clear. It got worse. The next morning brought a howling wind that piled snow in drifts taller than a man. Jacob stood at the window, jaw tight with frustration. I should have reinforced that tree line last fall. I knew those pines were stressed. You couldn't have known. I should have known. That's my job, to see these things coming. Catherine recognized the guilt in his voice. He'd failed to protect his first family from cholera. Now he was terrified of failing again. She went to him, took his rough hands in hers. We'll figure this out together. That's what we do. Over the next week, they developed a system. They melted snow for washing, carefully rationed their stored water for drinking and cooking. Jacob spent hours each day splitting and hauling wood to keep the fire going constantly. Catherine boiled everything twice the way Jacob taught her to make sure the melted snow was safe. It was hard work, and worry gnawed at both of them. Catherine could see the stress in Jacob's face, the way he'd wake at night and check their water supply. She knew he was calculating, always calculating how long they could last. Then, in the second week of their water crisis, Catherine started having pains. Not bad at first, just cramping that came and went. She didn't mention it to Jacob, not wanting to worry him more. But by the third day, she couldn't hide it. She was outside hauling a bucket of snow to melt when a sharp pain doubled her over. The bucket fell, spilling snow everywhere. Jacob was there in seconds. Catherine, what's wrong? Nothing, just a cramp. But he saw through the lie. He'd seen the tightness around her eyes, the way she'd been moving more carefully. How long has this been happening? A few days. It's probably nothing. Jacob's face went white. We're getting you to a doctor. Jacob, be reasonable. We can't travel in this weather, and I'm probably fine. You're bleeding. Catherine looked down. He was right. A dark stain was spreading on her dress. Fear, cold and sharp, cut through her. Jacob scooped her up like she weighed nothing and carried her inside. He laid her in bed, piled blankets over her. Stay still. Don't move. Jacob, what are we going to do? His hands were shaking as he built up the fire. I don't know, but I'm not losing you. I'm not losing another family. The hours that followed were the longest of Catherine's life. The pains came in waves, sometimes sharp enough to make her cry out. Jacob stayed by her side, helpless and terrified. He'd delivered calves and foals, but this was different. This was his wife, his child. Talk to me, Catherine gasped between pains. Tell me something, anything. So Jacob talked. He told her about the first time he saw a grizzly bear, the time he got lost in a blizzard and survived 3 days in a snow cave, the northern lights he'd seen from a mountain peak. He talked until his voice was hoarse, and Catherine held onto his words like a rope, pulling her through the pain. By dawn, the bleeding had slowed. The pains were less frequent. Catherine's face was pale, but she was conscious and clear-eyed. I think it's past, she whispered. Jacob pressed his forehead to her hand. Don't do that to me again. I'll do my best. They spent that day quietly, Jacob refusing to leave her side. He brought her warm broth, checked her constantly, adjusted pillows and blankets with gentle hands. And Catherine saw something in his face she'd never seen before, absolute terror at the thought of losing her. You really do love me, she said in wonder. Did you doubt it? No, but seeing it like this, seeing how scared you were. She reached for his hand. I love you too, more than I thought possible. That night, as Catherine slept, Jacob made a decision. When she woke, he was already dressed in his warmest gear, pack ready by the door. What are you doing? Going to town? We need medicine, supplies, and I need to get word to the doctor to come check on you when the weather breaks. Jacob, it's still dangerous out there, and it's dangerous in here. You almost lost the baby, Catherine. Maybe worse. I won't risk you because I'm too scared to travel. Catherine knew that tone. He'd made up his mind and nothing would change it. Then promise me you'll be careful. Promise you'll come back. I promise. I've got too much to come back to. Jacob left at first light. Catherine stood at the window, watching until he disappeared into the white landscape. Then she sat down and waited, one hand on her belly, hoping and praying. 2 days passed, then 3. The storm finally broke on the 4th day, leaving the world crystalline and still. Catherine kept herself busy checking trap lines close to the cabin, tending the fire, preparing food. But her eyes kept going to the trail, watching for any sign of movement. On the 5th day, she saw him. a dark figure trudging through the snow, pulling a small sled behind him. Catherine ran out without even grabbing her coat, slipping and sliding in her haste. Jacob caught her, held her tight. "I told you I'd come back. What took so long?" "Had to wait out the worst of it in a way station, and I wanted to make sure I got everything we needed." The sled was loaded with pipe, tools, medicine, and supplies. Jacob had even convinced the town doctor to write out instructions for pregnancy care and warning signs. But more than that, he'd brought hope. Over the next week, Jacob repaired the water system. He worked dawn to dusk, and Catherine could see the relief in his face as clean water started flowing again. With that crisis managed, he could focus on her health, on the baby. The doctor came 2 weeks later when the trails were passable. He examined Catherine carefully, asked questions, and finally smiled. "You gave yourself quite a scare, Mrs. Stone. But everything looks good now. The baby's heartbeat is strong. Just take it easy, no heavy work." After the doctor left, Jacob pulled Catherine close. "I thought I'd lost you. In those hours when you were bleeding, I thought, but you didn't lose me. We're both still here. I couldn't do this alone, Catherine. I thought I was strong enough. But I need you, not just for the baby, but for everything." Catherine rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Good thing I'm not going anywhere then." Outside, winter was starting to lose its grip. The days were getting longer, the sun stronger. Soon it would be spring. Time for new beginnings. Time for the life they were building together to truly take root. But for now, they stood together in their cabin, grateful to have survived the hardest months, grateful to have found each other, grateful for second chances and the promise of tomorrow. Spring came slowly to Montana, melting snow revealing brown earth and the first brave shoots of new growth. Catherine stood outside the cabin, one hand on her swollen belly, breathing in air that finally held warmth. 7 months pregnant now, and she'd never felt more alive. Jacob was working on the fence line, replacing posts damaged by the harsh winter. She watched him work, still amazed sometimes that this was her life now. A year ago, she'd been a desperate widow with no future. Now she had a husband who loved her and a baby on the way. "Careful there," Jacob called out. "Doctor said no heavy work. I'm just standing here enjoying the sunshine. Knowing you'll find something to lift in a minute." He wasn't wrong. Catherine had trouble sitting still these days. There was so much to do before the baby came. The garden needed planting, the cabin needed a thorough cleaning, and she wanted everything perfect. But first, they had a debt to settle. The furs from winter trapping had brought in good money. Combined with what they'd saved from careful trading, they finally had enough to pay the bank. More than enough, actually. They'd have money left over for supplies and even some savings. The next week, they rode to town together. Catherine was nervous, remembering the banker's cold face from last fall when he'd told her she had until spring to pay, or lose everything. Now spring was here, and she was ready. The banker, Mr. Peterson, looked surprised to see them walk into his office. His eyes went to Catherine's pregnant belly, then to Jacob standing protectively beside her. "Mrs. Mitchell. Or is it Mrs. Stone now?" "It's Mrs. Stone, and I'm here to settle my debt." Catherine placed the money on his desk. $200, exactly what she owed, plus the interest that had accumulated. Peterson counted it slowly, his expression unreadable. "This is unexpected," he said finally. "I assumed we'd be taking possession of the property." "Well, you assumed wrong." Catherine kept her voice steady. "The land is mine, bought and paid for." Peterson wrote out a receipt and stamped the deed paid in full. As Catherine took the papers, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she'd been carrying for months. The land was truly hers now. No one could take it from her. Outside the bank, Jacob pulled her into a hug. "You did it. We did it," she corrected. "I couldn't have managed without you." "Yes, you could have. But I'm glad you didn't have to." They celebrated with a meal at the town's small restaurant, a luxury they'd never have indulged in before. Other diners stared at them, probably wondering about the pregnant woman and the rough mountain man, but Catherine didn't care. Let them wonder. Let them talk. She had what mattered. On the ride home, Jacob was unusually quiet. Catherine knew that look. He was thinking hard about something. "What's on your mind?" she asked. "The baby's coming soon. Another month, maybe 2 at most." "I'm aware," Catherine said dryly, patting her belly. "And I've been thinking about what comes after. About my trap lines, about the life I used to have. Catherine's heart clenched. Was he having second thoughts? Planning to leave after all? Go on. I'm not going back, Jacob said simply. To the high country, I mean. Not like before. But that's your livelihood. Your life. Jacob pulled the wagon to a stop and turned to face her. My life is here now. With you and the baby. I can trap local lines, hunt nearby. We don't need me disappearing for months at a time. I don't want to miss my child growing up. I don't want you facing hard times alone. You're sure? You loved that freedom. I loved it because I was running from pain, but I'm not running anymore. I found something worth staying for. He took her hand. You asked me once if I regretted all those years alone. I said yes and no. Now it's just yes. I regret every year I didn't have this. Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. You're a good man, Jacob Stone. I'm a lucky man. Luckier than I deserve. The next month was a flurry of preparation. Jacob finished all the repairs on the homestead, making sure everything was secure. Catherine prepared the cabin, washing and mending baby clothes that Jacob had bought or traded for. The cradle sat ready beside their bed, waiting for its occupant. Neighbors started stopping by, women mostly, bringing gifts and advice. Mrs. Henderson from 4 miles south brought a beautiful quilt she'd sewn. Young Mary Chen, barely 16 and newly married herself, brought jars of preserved fruit. Even old Bill the Trapper, Jacob's friend, came by with a tiny fur cap he'd made. For the little one, he said gruffly. Keep his head warm come next winter. Catherine was touched by the kindness. These were hard people living in hard country, but they took care of their own. And somewhere along the way, she'd become one of them. The baby came on a warm evening in late May. Catherine had been working in the garden when the first real contractions hit. She'd been having false pains for days, so at first she thought it was more of the same. But these were different, stronger, impossible to ignore. Jacob, she called out, and he came running from the barn. One look at her face and he knew. It's time? I think so. Jacob helped her inside, his hands gentle despite his obvious panic. Mrs. Henderson had agreed to come help with the birth, and Jacob rode hard to fetch her. While he was gone, Catherine tried to remember everything the doctor had told her. Everything the neighbor women had advised. This was it. No turning back now. Mrs. Henderson arrived quickly, calm and efficient. She sent Jacob to boil water and gather clean cloths, giving him tasks to keep him busy and out of the way. Then she turned to Catherine with a kind smile. First babies take their time, dear. We've got a long night ahead. She wasn't wrong. The labor lasted through the night and into the next morning. Catherine had never known such pain, such exhaustion. But Mrs. Henderson coached her through it. And Jacob held her hand whenever he was allowed in the room, his face pale but determined. As the sun climbed high in the sky, Catherine felt a shift. A change. Mrs. Henderson checked her and smiled. Almost there. On the next pain you push with everything you've got. Catherine pushed and kept pushing until she thought she couldn't anymore. Then she heard it. A thin, angry cry that was the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard. It's a boy, Mrs. Henderson announced, holding up a red-faced, screaming infant. A healthy, strong boy. They let Jacob in then. And Catherine watched as he approached the bed like he was walking on holy ground. Mrs. Henderson placed the baby in his arms, and Jacob stared down at his son with an expression of absolute wonder. He's perfect, Jacob whispered. He's absolutely perfect. The baby had dark hair like Jacob and blue eyes that would probably change. He had strong lungs, that was certain, and he was already trying to lift his head to look around. Catherine watched her husband cradle their son, saw tears running down Jacob's weathered face, and felt her heart overflow. What should we name him? Jacob asked. Catherine had thought about this a lot. I'd like to name him after Robert, my first husband. He'd be glad to know something good came from this land he loved, but I want his middle name to be Jacob after his father. Jacob looked at her with shining eyes. Robert Jacob Stone, it's a strong name. For a strong boy. He'll need it growing up out here. Mrs. Henderson stayed another day to make sure both mother and baby were doing well. Then she left them with instructions and well wishes, riding back to her own homestead. And suddenly it was just the three of them, Catherine, Jacob, and baby Robert. That first week was exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. The baby woke every few hours, demanding to be fed. Catherine was sore and tired, but every time she looked at her son, she felt only joy. And Jacob was a revelation as a father. He changed diapers without complaint, walked the floor for hours when the baby cried, and sang old songs in a surprisingly gentle voice. "You're a natural at this," Catherine told him one night. Watching him rock the baby. "Second time around, you remember things, or maybe I just appreciate it more knowing what I lost." He looked down at the sleeping infant. Every moment with him feels like a gift. As spring turned to summer, they settled into their new life as a family. The homestead thrived under their care. Catherine's garden grew lush and green. Jacob's trap lines provided steady income, and baby Robert grew bigger and stronger every day. One evening in late June, they sat on the porch together watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. Robert slept in Catherine's arms, peaceful and content. Jacob had his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into his warmth. "A year ago, I was standing in front of your door, wondering if you'd shoot me for suggesting what I did," Jacob said. "A year ago, I thought my life was over, and now—" Catherine looked at the land spread out before them, land that was truly hers. She looked at the baby in her arms, healthy and loved. She looked at the man beside her, who'd started as a stranger with an unusual proposal and become the love of her life. "Now I think it's just beginning." Jacob kissed the top of her head. "I came here to keep a promise, to help a widow through winter, to have a son to carry my name. I got all that, but I got so much more. I got a home, a family, a reason to face each morning. I got you." He turned to look at her. "Thank you for taking a chance on a desperate mountain man." Catherine smiled. "Thank you for keeping your promise to a desperate widow, even if things didn't turn out quite like we planned." "Better," Jacob said firmly. "They turned out better." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Catherine felt a deep sense of peace. Life was hard out here, and it would continue to be hard. There would be more winters to survive, more challenges to face. But they would face them together. This family forged from unlikely circumstances and sealed with genuine love. Baby Robert stirred in her arms, making small sounds in his sleep. Catherine wondered what kind of man he'd grow up to be. Strong like his father, she hoped. Resilient like both his parents had learned to be. But most of all, she hoped he'd understand that families come in all forms, built in all kinds of ways, and that what matters isn't how they start, but how they choose to continue. The mountain wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and sage. Jacob tightened his arm around Catherine's shoulders. Their son slept peacefully, and the land they'd fought so hard to keep stretched out around them, beautiful and wild and home. By winter, she'd had his son, just as the mountain man had promised. But somewhere along the way, they'd created something even more valuable than kept promises. They'd created a family built on respect, partnership, and love that neither of them had expected to find again. And that, Catherine thought, was worth more than all the gold in Montana.